first group of, first large group of transracial and international adoptees, which was from South Korea. It was like there was a neon sign over us at all times. And people then really did not recognize my family as a family. So people would constantly ask my parents, they would point, which was very impolite, they would point at us and say, whose children are those? And my mother would sometimes become angry and say, well, they're ours, of course. But in those days, people did not recognize families created through transracial adoption as families. Tall, bald Norwegian American father, plump German American mother, and two crew cut headed Korean children. So I experienced a lot of feeling of marginalization, being pointed out. And one of the things that came to me that is a theme that comes up constantly in our groups is the narrative burden. And I always want to credit Sumitra Dorner, who's a good friend and who is an adoptee born in India, who came up with that term and introduced it to us when we gathered in 2002 or 2003 in Washington, D.C., about 60 of us transracial international adoptees. And the narrative burden is precisely that. It's the imposition on certain people to have to constantly explain who and what they are. And that happened to be constantly. I still get that as an adult. Fortunately now, I mostly, in my life, I live in a very diverse, tolerant, cosmopolitan area in a large city. So I don't get it in the same way I did as a child. But having those experiences really profoundly impacted me. And that's an example of where I can help fellow adult transracial adoptees and adoptive parents, because both groups face that narrative burden and have to deal with it.
Thank you. And this is kind of expounding on that narrative burden piece. Can you also talk then about the quote, angry adoptee that you mentioned in your book and what that means for people at home who maybe have heard that or maybe they haven't heard it, and how that kind of goes hand in hand in some ways with the narrative burden process as well?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Tony. I mean, the angry adoptee concept is a little bit complex in context because, first of all, I sit in privilege as an adoptee who did have loving parents. I know, sadly, many adoptees who did not, and many adoptees who actually were abused by their parents. But the term is generally used in adoption spaces and weaponized against adoptees who don't support what we sometimes refer to as the rainbows and unicorns view of adoption, especially transracial adoption, that everything's wonderful, everything's beautiful. And adoptees who do not ascribe to that view or perception are often targeted and labeled. So sometimes they do have certain resentments regarding their experiences, and very often those are very justified and legitimate. So the term is very often weaponized against adoptees who do not support the rainbows and unicorns concept. And I like to kind of turn it around on adoptive parents, because it's a binary categorization of people. Either you're happy or angry or bitter. And I like to say to parents, can you imagine if you had to carry a label of either being a happy adoptive parent or an angry adoptive parent? And if you're happy, you're dancing through fields of daisies in the sunshine on a summer afternoon, 24/7, 365. And if you're angry, of course, you're despondent 24/7, 365. That's not the human experience. And I think that people need to understand that we all have very complex experiences. Many adoptees do legitimately feel that adoption has in certain ways made their lives difficult. And that's a legitimate view. Everyone has the right to that. So I try very, very hard never to use the term angry adoptee. And I also react when people weaponize it.
I'm just curious, and was that part of your impetus for creating transracial adoption perspectives to kind of not have that rainbows and unicorns and not have that angry adoptee narrative out there in this
Yeah,
particular group?
it partly was. What happened was, it's kind of a funny story. My friend Michelle Hughes, who is an adoption attorney and an adoptive parent, and who has been educating transracial adoptive parents for many years now. I've known her for many years here in Chicago, where we both live. And she and I were put into a group. It's funny how you can just be, put into a group on Facebook. And I didn't even realize I was in it. And the group that we were in, I don't remember the name of it. I don't remember the name of the person who ran it, but she was an adult transracial adoptee. But the group was really poorly run, and there was all sorts of bad stuff going on. And Michelle and I protested some bad stuff going on, and we were immediately kicked out. So Michelle sent me a PM on Facebook saying, well, how about if we just create our own group? And I said, sure. That's how much thinking there was. And so we created the group, and within a day, we had several hundred members. We both believe in the concept of what I call sitting in complexity. And we both believe that the most useful thing that you can do in a group around transracial adoption is to sit in complexity, look at all the issues, discuss them calmly with one another, respect one another. And at that time, really, there were mostly rainbows and unicorns groups on Facebook. And there were a few extreme anti-adoption groups, but we couldn't find any that were neither of the two. So we created Transracial Adoption Perspectives. We created its predecessor, and then we had to recreate it. There's kind of a long story there, but we created the original group to sit in complexity and to help everyone connected to transracial adoption in any way to be able to move forward on their journey through the facilitation of discussion that could help them.
Thank you so much for that. And the group I know has helped countless people.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, because I'm a member of the group as well, so sometimes I'm reading some of the stories that parents have, and they're talking about sometimes the racism that their children have experienced, either at the age of 6 or the age of 12 or at the age of 22. Growing up for you, what was some of the feelings attached to when you had those experiences with racism as a transracial adoptee? How did you feel when those things happened? And what are some pieces of advice that you give to parents around how they can speak to their kids about racism?
Yeah, great question, Tony. There are several pieces to my answer. First of all, as I mentioned, I grew up in the 1960s and 70s. I mean, my twin brother and I never discussed it. We never mentioned it to our parents. We were teased and taunted. Fortunately, I was never beaten up. Half the transracial adoptee males I know were physically attacked, but I internalized it tremendously. I ended up with a terrible complex about my appearance. I have literally spent my entire life working on that. I'm gradually getting better. What is interesting is parents who join our group very often join the impetus. They start looking around Facebook after their child goes to preschool, and the child's first day, they have a racist experience. And the child comes home crying and tells the parent about, something terrible that another child said or did. And the scales kind of fall from the parents' eyes, because so often adoptive parents do come into transracial adoption with a rainbows and unicorns perspective. So my part of my sense of mission is so much fueled by trying to help parents to see that they need to begin to talk about race and racism even before their children can understand. And that's very hard because white people did not grow up experiencing it, and therefore they're having to try to parent children who are having lived experiences that are different from the ones they had. And I understand that that's very difficult. And so often we get comments like, well, little Susie is only 4, and it breaks my heart that I'll have to explain racism to her. So I'm going to wait until she has an experience and then we'll talk. And so I tell my traffic safety story, if may that share that with you. So I came up with a little story that I hoped people would be able to grasp. After hearing this, my little Susie is only 4, she's innocent, I want to keep her innocent, I don't want to talk about race, for like the billionth time. So I said, imagine that, little Susie is 3 or 4, and you're having coffee with a friend and you say, I couldn't possibly traumatize little Susie by letting her know that she could be hurt in traffic. So I'm just going to let her run out into the street and be hit by a car. And then after she's in the ICU, hopefully she'll live. And after she's in the ICU with all her bones broken and her internal organs crushed, I'll pull up a chair by her bedside and we'll have a nice chat about traffic safety. And then I say, how does that sound? And of course, parents are, they gasp and they're like, oh my gosh, and then they get it, because that's what racism is like. And far better is for you as a loving parent to prepare your child for the inevitable experience of racism. Because if your child is a child of color, they will have that experience, 100% certainty. And I experienced it as a profound trauma. No one ever explained it to me. And I spent many years unspooling that, unpacking it, and figuring it out. So if there's a single thing that I can do in these groups, along with other adoptees, we can talk about how devastating it was to experience racism and why parents, white parents, must figure out how to talk about it. They have to talk about it very, very early on, especially if their child is of a different race. But I have a daughter who's biological to me, who's multiracial. I was able to explain racism to her before she was 4. I waited a little bit longer to race. I waited a little longer to explain racism. But if your child is transracially adopted, you can't wait that long. And I think some parents are, when they hear this, especially when they hear the traffic safety story, they're like, oh, okay. So.
Exactly. Right. We want to be preventative in how we're thinking about how to discuss these things with our children, because these are tools that we're providing them moving forward that we know are going to come in handy for them. And it's not only related to their personal and physical safety, because that is a huge component, but it's also related to their mental health and well-being as well moving forward. A lot of
Tony, may I add one more comment as while I think about it?
Please do.
So, first of all, one book I recommend to every white person is White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. I think it's just an incredibly important book. And I mention it in this context because it took me a few years to figure this out, really, but White Fragility is kind of at the core of the reluctance of some white parents to talk about racism with their children of color. They themselves feel fragile. And I try not to say that in a judgmental way. It's just the reality. It's too hard for them to think about racism, I think the vast majority of people, white people in this country, still have a very profound challenge in terms of thinking about what racism actually is. Um, Somehow in this culture, we still have this idea. The only thing that's racism is like literally Klan members in bed sheets burning crosses on lawns, right? Like that's racism, but everything else that happens, oh, well, that's not really racism, right? Um, and white fragility prevents many white parents from learning enough, educating themselves so that they can then help their children of color. Sorry, I just wanted to mention that also.
No, those are all phenomenal points and leads me into my next question, actually. As you were speaking, I was also thinking about your racialized experience as, yes, an interracial adoptee, but as a Korean intercountry interracial adoptee. And in your book, you describe some of the complexities that that brought you as well, even when you were interacting with people of color that were not Asian or were not Asian American. Can you speak about that racism piece a little bit from that perspective, but also about that connection piece that you were able to find later on
Yeah.
and how important and impactful that was for you?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, first of all, we have systemic racism in our society and it impacts everyone. We're all marinated in it. One of the very sad things is that people of color will express um, sentiments to each other of different races that are also very sad and unfortunate. It's because we're all marinated in racism. Um, One of the things that I think is incredibly important, I talk about the importance of mirrors, and I talk about how in the book and also in our groups, how I feel that every child of color in this country, I'm talking about the United States now, but it's true elsewhere as well, needs to see on a daily basis, both adults and children of their own race, but also of all other non-white races. It's the way that we get towards a level of racial wokeness that we need to have to survive as people of color. And one of the wonderful things that has happened to me as an adult is I've made so many connections with my fellow POC brothers and sisters of non-Asian races. But in order to do that, I had to be in a place where I was open, I was educated enough socially and culturally to interact with people of all races. And that was a learned thing. I wanted it when I was a child, but I didn't have enough exposure. It was difficult when I was very young. So I think parents owe it to their children to give them racial mirrors of all races. Fortunately, that's far more possible now than it was when I was a child. And I'm thrilled when adoptive parents tell me, yes, my child goes to a school that's 20% Black, 15% Latinx, 15% Asian, even Native American children. And my child interacts with people of all those races every day. That to me is the ideal.
I agree. I agree. Great points there. And oftentimes parents also wonder to themselves, why isn't my child talking to me about race? We live in a diverse community. We have these cultural artifacts in the home, and we're going to all these events, and we think that this is enough. We think that we're doing all that we can be doing, but our child is still uncomfortable. And in a lot of those cases, it's because some of the ways that parents are engaging in those things maybe don't feel genuine to the child that exists within that household and feel maybe intentional, yes, but not as though the parents really want to be doing this themselves.
Right.
It can't be just a checkbox item. But I also wanted to mention as well that sometimes children within these homes are also experiencing kind of difficult situations, racism, problematic comments from other family members, maybe outside of the immediate adoptive family, who were their cousins, for example, but maybe they feel kind of fearful of talking to their parents about those things. Can
Yeah.
you talk a bit about some of those situations in which family members might be able to spot some of the problematic comments that are coming from other family members, and how they can react and what they can do about that to make sure they're building healthy identity formations for their children?
Yeah, absolutely, Tony. Well, first of all, I should just say for context, as I mentioned before, I grew up in the 1960s and 1970s. My parents were just phenomenally non-racist for people of their demographic and culture in their time. Most of both my father's and my mother's relatives were racist. I mean, they were absolutely in line with what most white people were like in the 60s and 70s. But I look back now, and most of their relatives, I would call them racist. They said racist things. They felt racist things. They said racist things in front of me. So that's one thing. I mean, thank goodness we're not in 1964 anymore. I mean, the society has changed. But so that's one thing. Often it's really true. Many adoptive parents really don't know how many racists there are in their extended families or among their neighbors until they adopt transracially, because most white people don't talk about race most of the time. The other element of this is I constantly urge white parents to start talking about race in front of their children, even at the very, very earliest ages. Turn on TV programs that involve people of color, which you should be doing anyway if you have a child of color. Talk about what you see. You know, you're Joe and Jane, and you say in front of your child of color, "Oh, look at what that person said on that TV show. What do you think, Jane?" You know, because that will give your child permission to talk about race. It was very clear to me growing up that no one was going to give me permission to talk about race. That was just so obvious. My gosh. And your child needs to get permission from you. Now, I will say in 2022, because there's so much out there in the mainstream media and entertainment media, the chances are greater that your child might initiate a discussion of race, but it's quite possible they still won't. So often children, I mean, this is kind of obvious parenting 101, but children look to their parents for cues as to what they can talk about and think about and what they can share. And I know countless adult transracial adoptees who have shared with me they never felt they had permission to talk about race. So talk about it and talk about what's on the news. I mean, obviously, you know, age appropriately and all that. One of the things that I talk about in the book, and I've talked about it in the groups, is parents will say to me, white parents will say, "Well, I just don't even know where to begin. You know, I'm not going to, start with the autobiography of Malcolm X when my child is 3 or something." And I say, no, you start as early as you can with things they already know. So I tell this other story. I say, well, imagine if your kindergarten teacher, Miss Jones, came to class one day, and she had a bag of candies. And she said, well, I'm going to give out candies, but only to the white children. And you say that to your child, and you say, well, that would be mean and unfair, right? That would not be fair. And you can start at that simple level, right? Like, why would it be unfair to give candies to one group of children and not the other? You start with things that children can understand. And even if 3-year-olds understand fairness at a basic level, and you make it obviously at an age like that, 3 or 4 or 5, you don't include violence or anything like that. You just start at really simple levels that aren't threatening, but that help a child to begin to reason so that they can then also understand. Because your child is having experiences of race already, whether you know it or not. We had one father years and years and years ago. I don't remember his name. And of course, I wouldn't mention it if I did. And he said in our group, he said, well, and he had a Latina daughter. He said, well, my daughter is 4 and she's never expressed any bad experiences with race to us. And I remember reading, and he soon after fled. And I remember reading this comment, and first of all thinking, okay, she's 4. Like, what would she be telling you at 4? And secondly, reading his comment, I thought, well, you almost certainly have not created an atmosphere in your home where your daughter would share anything. You have to share with her so that she has permission and she can begin to identify things. I had to learn how to identify racism all by myself. There was no one who explained it to me ever when I was a child. So, and children are, of course, very intuitive. I understood what was going on at a very, very visceral level, but there was no framing for it and there was no vocabulary. So it just sat inside me until I was a young adult and I was able to begin to really process it.
It's very powerful. And again, just a reminder of how these things aren't just childhood things that interracial adoptees are going through, but in a nod to your book, again, are lifelong journeys
Yeah.
in those ways and processes. Tying back into that, I also wanted to ask about internalized racism as well. You talk about that in your
Yeah.
book. How do you think internalized racism kind of stews and festers in the hearts and the minds of interracial adoptees? And maybe also moving into, you talk about being in the fog as well. How
Yeah.
do those two things kind of tie together, and how does one come out of both of those processes?
Great question, Tony. So I try, it's interesting because I've talked about my struggle with my appearance for many years now. And it's very curious, because many white adoptive parents try to kind of dismiss it. And then the ones who do accept it end up kind of tragedizing it. And what I mean is, I grew up, it was clear to me, I kind of say it's a little dramatic, being non-white was a crime. It was a social crime when I was growing up. And it was very clear to me that I was not, I don't even, I try to explain it. It's not even that I was ugly. It was that I was from the planet Pluto, right? And I internalized that very deeply. And it really, on a certain level, I still struggle with it, but I'm doing a lot better at the age of 61. But think about it. I've been struggling with it all my life. So I internalized the racism to myself as being someone who is unacceptable. And the other part of this, what was the second part of your question again? That was,
The second part of it was the fog that
oh
then
yeah, the
kind of
fall.
develops
Yeah.
as a result.
Well, every adult transracial adoptee I've ever talked with about this concept, once we introduce it into a conversation, the fog, the adoptee fog, says, oh yes. Some are still, I mean, sadly, some never leave it, like they're in it their whole lives. But what the fog means basically is an inability to see the true broader frame of their narrative. As I say, I grew up with very loving parents who were exceptionally non-racist for the time and place in which they lived, exceptionally, especially my mother. But I was surrounded by racism. And I internalized it. I knew it was, it was like something in the air, and it took me so long to figure out what was going on. I got a wonderful push toward the future. I always wanted to be in the kind of sociocultural environment I'm in now, which is filled with people of color, filled with diversity, very cosmopolitan. But of course, I grew up in this completely white environment. So I went to the University of Wisconsin undergrad, And at that time, it was still pretty white, but it was a huge, huge, huge improvement over the neighborhood I grew up in Milwaukee. And then I came to graduate school at Northwestern University at the Medill School of Journalism here in Chicago. And it was wonderful because that school was a pioneer. They had several Black deans in 1981 at a time when that was just, I don't think that any other school of journalism was as far along as they were. And eventually, years later, now they have a Black dean of the entire school, but they had a number of deans who were not the top dean. And they purposefully recruited a student body in the graduate program that was extremely diverse, both by race and by socioeconomic background. So we had children, not children, we were young adults. We had students from extremely wealthy backgrounds and, you know, people from very disadvantaged backgrounds and everywhere in between. So that was the beginning. It was the first time, it was thrilling for me. It was the first time that I was in a situation where it was normal to be interacting with all sorts of people of color. And I had just landed in Chicago. I knew that was the direction I wanted to take. I wanted to colorize my world. It just took years to meet people, you know, as it does when you come to a new city. And over a period of time, I was able to do that. One of the things that's so hard for many transracial adoptees is when they come into young adulthood, they actually have really bad experiences with people of their own race. If they were raised in total whiteness, they're not culturally fluent. And for a few years, I was advising a white mom in one of our groups. She and her husband adopted 2 Black children. They raised them in a very, very white area. And their daughter came to a large city. I don't want to specify even which cities, but she moved to a large city when she was about 20 years old. And she had quite dispiriting experiences at first because she was not, young Black adults knew she was not raised Black. They could just tell. As I like to say, people can smell you, right? They can figure it out. And she was just devastated because she thought, you know, she experienced racism growing up. She thought, well, I'll be, you know, navigating largely young Black adult society, and of course I'll be accepted. And she wasn't at first. And it took her a few years. She learned the culture and she was able to become culturally fluent. You know, she couldn't code switch. She didn't know the cultural references. Really, it's, and this mom said to me, you know, we just didn't know when our kids were young. We didn't know, we had no idea. I feel so regretful. And I said to her, don't feel regretful. Just do what you can to support your daughter now. And the daughter struggled for several years and now she's doing really well. So honestly, parents in 2022, don't do this to your kids. You know, give them the tools and the experiences in the environment so that they don't have the experience that this gal went through. It was just really, really hard for her. Fortunately, the good news is she's doing well now.
Well, that's really great to hear. At the same time, again, another example of adulthood and the challenges that interracial adoptees face during that particular period of time.
Yeah.
We might have parents out there who have children who are older children, maybe they're 17, 18, maybe they're 22, maybe they're 30. What advice would you give to parents of older children around feelings of, for parents of, maybe I didn't do this the right way when they were younger, and maybe now I feel like it's too late? What type of advice would you give to those parents as well?
Well, first of all, I would say it's never too late. And secondly, you know, as I said to this mom, I said, you know, really, it's pointless to get caught up in feelings of guilt and regret. She really was, she had very deep feelings of guilt and regret. She said, you know, my daughter is struggling. It breaks my heart. I feel terrible. I said, you know, don't, you know, you can spend 3 seconds feeling terrible and the rest of the time, just do everything you can to support her. by the time, 20, it's interesting, at that point, the daughter had moved to a large city, was trying to integrate into a socially Black community. And I just said to the mother, and there was, an element there, where the daughter was lashing out at the parents. She was like, why, I hate that you made me so unprepared. And I just said to her, it is what it is. You can't change the past, but you can support your daughter. You can express over and over and over again, I am here for you, and let's do something that you would like to do that supports your identity. Even at that age, many white parents still are not comfortable enough to, like attend a mostly or all Black gathering, for example. That just like, get over yourself, do it for your child who's now 20 years old, um, because they do need the support as your young adults too. The other thing is, start when they're young. One of the key things, we had someone say in our group years ago, I mean, it was kind of cringefully funny. She said, I'm a white mom of a very small Black child, very young Black child, and I go up to random Black women in the grocery store and ask them if they'll be my friend. And, and I read this, I was like, oh my gosh, okay. Like, who wouldn't like flee? Like, okay, what's the story here? You have to find friends of your child's race in an organic way, and you have to develop authentic friendships. I say start with your interests. Like, you like canasta, find canasta players, right? Join a canasta club, or gardening, or whatever it might be. Find people whom you can truly be friends with. Do it when your child is very, very young. Start when your child is 1 year old. Um, and then your child will have mentors of their race to whom they can talk and learn things from that you cannot teach your child. That's the profound challenge of transracially adoptive parenting. There are things, if you're a white person, there are things you cannot teach your child of color because you didn't experience them yourself. So start very early. Just if your child is already 21, just do what you can to support them. And at any age, get out of your comfort zone. Just, don't. I see it so often, white parents being so afraid because they grew up entirely in white culture. So it's understandable, right? Like, they're afraid to go to a gathering that will be majority people of their child's race, because they haven't even interacted with people of their child's race. And therein lies the problem, right?
Yes, and I think you make a great point there about the importance of parents then making genuine friendships with not only members of different races from their own, but if they can, with the child's racial groups as well. Just a very quick aside, one parent was a white adoptive parent of Black children, and they were telling me that they had an interest in books. And so they decided to join a book club,
Mhm.
and the book club was a book club centering Black authors that happened to have a lot of Black individuals in that book club. And then they invited some of the members of the book club over for dinner at their house one night. And so they were having individuals in their lives and doing that racial mirroring in a way that felt very genuine and organic to their interests. And
That's
so
right.
that's something that's important for parents to be able to do. Find things that you're interested in, and then find ways to connect in those ways. So
Right, because then you develop authentic friendships. They're based on common interests, and you get to know them as people. And that's when the people of color will share it with you, the white parent, truthfully. I so often hear from white adoptive parents, well, I'm always afraid that people of color I know are guarded, they won't share. Well, a lot of times they won't share because they've been burned like a billion times. they'll share something real with a white friend and then they'll be dismissed. So you have to get to know people really well before they'll share with you. There are a lot of things I would not share with random white people. I just wouldn't. It's not worth the risk. And yeah, I don't recommend rushing up to random people of color in grocery stores and saying, I want to be your friend.
That might not be the best way to
Yeah.
go about doing this. I agree. I also wanted to touch upon a very important topic that we haven't talked about as much tonight, birth family connection. Talk about the importance of birth family connection for, yes, adoptees, but some of the intersectionality there that's going on with birth family connection and racial implications of that for the interracial adoptee and for the interracial adoptive family.
Yeah. And it is all very complex. I'm currently advising a white mom who is in a very, very complex situation in that way, where there are birth family members not behaving in a way that's helpful. So it can be complex. But what I would say is, yes, whenever it's possible and whenever it's safe, those connections can be almost unbelievably validating and supportive for the child, because they're actually seeing someone who's related to them in their, hopefully in their natural environment. And that can just be so affirming for the child. I totally support it. Obviously there are situations, I always say this to parents, obviously, if there's any personal safety issue, you have to think through that very carefully. Um, we sometimes have parents ask, like a parent is incarcerated or there may have been physical violence. So you have to think through that. But setting all those situations aside, yeah, I think birth family connections can be extremely powerful and helpful. They help a child heal too, because every adoptee develops their own narrative, and they may be, if they came out of trauma or if they came out of a very difficult situation, that impinges on their personal narrative. And any connection they can have with a birth family member can be extremely healing.
Thank you for that. I think that's so important for parents out there to hear. And I also wanted to dive into this again. You talked about this at the beginning of our discussion here. Why did you decide to include adoptee voices in your book? And what type of thoughts did you have about what types of perspectives you wanted to share? Because often interracial, transracial adoptees, we get grouped into kind of one group, right? But we have these unique, complex experiences. So how did you go about kind of
Yeah.
hitting some of those in the book?
Well, first of all, I couldn't resist because there were fabulous people like you, Tony, who I just needed to include. But what I was going to say is, if you read the interviews, well, you were one of them. If one reads the 13 interviews, one will see that I try to include a really broad range of experiences. First of all, I included adoptees from one set of origins to another. So I have a Chinese Spanish adoptee, a Colombian Norwegian adoptee, a Bangladeshi Danish adoptee, etc. I also wanted to include a range of experiences. So in your case, you were in an open adoption, and I was thrilled to be able to include your voice because of that. I included adoptees who have successfully done birth search and found birth family. So there was that. And of course, all genders, different ages. One of the things, per what you just said, yes, we human beings tend to overgeneralize everything. There's a range of people in my a group of 13 adoptees, and they don't, each one of them represents a group. So I have Black biracial, Latine, Native American, East Asian, and South Asian adoptees represented, and they're all individuals, and they all have very specific lived experiences. So I thought that was important. My voice is only one voice, and my lived experience is only one. There's no way that I, as one person, can represent an umbrella of experiences. So I thought the best thing to do would simply be to have 13 friends and acquaintances share their stories. And they're quite different stories. And I thought that would be really important. And that's why I did it.
Well, thank you. And thank you for including a broad range of perspectives, for also including stories like mine in that particular, um, in those perspectives as well. I think that there's a lot of value in making sure that we're not categorizing and placing adoptees or interracial adoptees in kind of one box. And like
Yeah,
you said, overgeneralizing in those ways.
yeah,
We're,
exactly.
we're moving closer to the end. So before we are going to do a question and answer section, but before we do that, any closing thoughts on advice for parents of interracial adoptees out there, or for interracial adoptees themselves as well?
Yeah, I think I'll just go back to the title of my book. It's a lifelong journey. It has tremendous complexity. I am still learning and growing. I'm going to be 62 this fall, and I'm still learning and growing. And I think adoptees need to give themselves patience and give themselves grace, and know that there are fellow adoptees out there to help them heal. And I just want to encourage all adoptive parents, some white transracially adoptive parents, they see that once they realize the complexity, then they're completely um, uh, completely inundated or overwhelmed by it. And they shouldn't be. Just go step by step. Learn. For adoptive parents, please listen to the voices of adoptees. Listen to the whole range. And we're as diverse as any other people, you know. So any other group of people. So I guess I would just go back to, it is a lifelong journey, and it's a lifelong journey for the parents as well. Be patient with yourself, learn as much as you can. You know, I so appreciate being able to share. You know, as you know, my book is available online. Just go to the website. It's just markhaglandbook.com. And I'm very glad to answer any questions or respond to any comments.
Thank you so much, Mark. And we value and appreciate your perspective, your expertise, and all that you add to this community. And as you mentioned, we do want to move now to the question and answer section. So anyone that has a question, please feel free. I see Ruth.
I see Ruth. Hi, Ruth. How are you? You can unmute yourself. Please go ahead. I'm so glad you could be here. I've never seen your beautiful face in person, or well, Zoom. Yeah.
Hold on one second. Let me get this unmuted here.
Yeah,
Can you hear me now?
yeah, you're great. You're great.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for doing this, Mark. I know that you and I have connected online. I think I've also talked with Tony a little bit just on social media also. As a transracial adoptee who had 9 years in foster care from 0 to 9, and then was adopted by very progressive white parents in the early 70s. One of the things I will have to say, I do say about my parents, is that they were very progressive, but yet they were progressive adjacent. You know, they had their families both from Wisconsin,
Yeah,
but they lived here in California, you know, very much liberal. But it was still hard. And it was really hard trying to identify with other Black people when I was younger, because I thought, oh, they'll like me. And it's been a hard process. because I don't know the code switch thing. I just learned about that a couple years ago. And, so I just want people to accept me the way I come, and it's not easy, but I appreciate so much Tony's voice and your voice. And there's a little more complication, especially being a Black adoptee here in the United States with white parents. I tell people, think about what it was like as a 13-year-old to be watching Roots with your white parents.
Yeah.
And she's really excited about it. She's excited about this opportunity. So I appreciate you. And I hope that we can continue to get our voice out there, and that we are in a position right now where people really need to hear from us.
Yeah. And I would love it, Ruth, if you wrote something and put it online. If you ever want to dialogue with me and we can put something online, let me know, because your voice is so valuable. I so appreciate it.
I'm not a writer, but I'm trying to figure out how to put my voice out there.
We could talk.
Because living in liberal Los Angeles, I mean, seriously, we're in the melting pot right here, but it's still hard. It's still hard.
Yeah.
So yes, Mark, I will reach out to you. And thank you, Tony, for facilitating this, and for everyone who joined.
Thank you so much, Ruth.
Thank you, Ruth. Ruth makes great points there again. Mark, did you want to respond, or should we move to additional questions?
Yeah, are there any other questions? Or is there, I haven't been able to look at the chat because I was focusing on you, Tony, but is there anything in the chat where we can, oh, thank you. Oh, is Rhonda here? Oh my gosh, how wonderful.
Yes.
Oh, Kaisa Clark. Hi. I probably said your name wrong.
That's okay. It was close. It's Kaisa.
Kaisa, hi.
And it's actually a Scandinavian name.
Oh, just like me, Norwegian.
Exactly. Yeah. Hi. So I am a international transracial adult adoptee. I work as an adoption social worker most of the time. I actually did the TAC training, and this actually reminds me I still need to sit for my exam because I took it a couple years ago. So thanks for that reminder about TAC. When I'm not, I've started recently in the last couple of years, leaving adoption social work, and I've started contracting as a social worker on overseas military bases for the US. And those instances are actually the times where I've had kind of the most diversity in my life. I grew up in a town of like 3,000 people. The town I live in now is maybe like 16 or 17,000 people. It's very, very white. So I very much often say that like I'm a white girl in a brown body, and that's just kind of my experience and how it is. Wonderful parents. They lived internationally. They lived in the country where I was born, very open and wonderful. And, we talk a lot about at work when we're working with prospective adoptive parents or foster parents, a lot about what you talked about how do we diversify our own lives? How do we create it in kind of this natural way for the kids in our lives so that they have exposure to other people or people who look like them or who reflect their culture? And so I know we say it all the time. And I'm just wondering if you have any other kind of advice or feedback for those of us who do live and work in towns of 3,000 people or 10 or 20,000 people, and we don't have access to the same amount of diversity. And sometimes it does turn out to be just, that one friend who is a person of color, and just, so much of America is rural, and there are still so many families who are growing their families through adoption and who are fostering. And, I even look back at my colleagues, and my entire team is white. And, and very few of those people are personally touched by adoption. And so there's so many things that are happening and going on. So I'm just wondering if you have any, what does small town America do in these circumstances?
Well, first of all, if you're a transracial adoptee, just go online and find people. If it comes down to that you're going to Skype with someone every week, to get your nourishment, do what you need to. For parents, I do, so I sit in complexity there, because we will often get parents in our groups saying, well, we wish we could, but we didn't know, and we can't move, and blah, blah, blah. And, my husband will lose his job and never find another, and all that. And I say, okay, do the best you can. Do the best you can. I'll never forget this. I was traveling, I was on a plane, I got off the plane. This was about 7 years ago. And we had a question from someone who said, we live, and I never found out exactly, I think they were in like far northern California or southern Oregon, which is very white. It's not like, the coastal cities. And a mom said, we had no idea when we had adopted and all that. And we have a Black son who's like, he was like 8 or 9. And she said, well, we live 400 miles from any people of color. And right away, I was like, oh my gosh, okay. And what can we do? And we can't move. We own a farm and all this stuff. And I was like, okay, well, all right. If you can't move, I guess the largest city was like San Francisco or something. So I said, make a commitment to drive into San Francisco once a month. Just go for a whole day, go to the area with the greatest diversity. So they had a Black son, see as many Black faces as you can, go to cultural events, go to restaurants, just anything you can. It would have been huge for me growing up if we had been able to see Asians every month. I mean, that really would have made a huge difference. So, and if you can move into diversity, I have a friend who's a white adoptive mom, and she and her husband adopted one child from South Korea and one from China. And I was speaking at the conference, and this was very early on for me. So I didn't realize that we adult transracial adoptees, that our voices might even be listened to. But I just said, move into diversity, just like, please move. And they did. They actually moved into diversity, and they said, you know what? It was the best decision we made in our lives. So if you can, if you're in an area that's super duper uber white, and you can move into an area with even moderate diversity, if you can, please do it. Do what you can for your child. And I don't want parents to tragedize my narrative and think that because I've spoken openly about my challenges with internalized racism and appearance, I don't want people to think I'm living a tragic life. I'm living a fabulous life. I'm very happy. Things are really great. But I share my story, definitely not to get petty, but rather to help parents understand the tremendously negative impact of growing up in extreme whiteness for children of color. It can be incredibly negatively impactful. And that's why I share. I'm doing fine in my life.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Mark. I think it's really helpful for people out there to understand that interracial adoptees are not the, quote, tragedized stories that are often portrayed in the media and other places,
No.
and that our experiences are complex. And yes, there's trauma there, but there's still beauty in a lot of our individual journeys as well.
If I may say, Tony, one of our big, I always say this in the TAP group, I know you've heard me say this, our biggest enemy is binary thinking, right? So either you're the happy, jubilant adoptee who's dancing through fields of daisies on a summer afternoon, 24/7, 365, or you're this tragic, like puddle on the sidewalk, right? Well, guess what? I'm neither, right? Like I have complex experiences. I'm having a really good life. I just want parents to understand the impacts of everything, all the choices that they're making.
Mark, let me say this really quickly.
Oh, sure. I'm not sure who that is, but
it's Ruth. It's Ruth.
Oh, it's Ruth. Hi, Ruth.
Even though that, and being in 2022, and I live in a very diverse city in Los Angeles. I live in Long Beach, but I grew up in Pasadena. My parents were very forward, but yet their family didn't agree to these adoptees. Their families didn't agree to these people of color.
Yeah.
And that's something we have to look at too. When
Okay.
when someone makes a decision to look at adoption, especially if it's due to infertility or whatnot, they're looking at it for what they want.
Yeah.
And sometimes I feel like they drape it in the guise of I want to save a child.
Yeah, there's saviorism. The other thing I'll say, Ruth, is a lot of time we hear so much in the groups. I had no idea, that Aunt Mickey was so racist. Well, you didn't, because you lived in a very white environment where people didn't talk about race. And so often white adoptive parents actually only really find out how racist their extended families are when they adopt, like after they adopt. And it's like, whoa, Uncle Ned just said something really horrific. And we honestly had never heard him say anything like that. So when you adopt a child of color, you're opening a big box. I agree. And we get into very complex decisions. There are people who have had to cut off almost their entire extended family. I always sit in complexity around that, because sometimes we'll say, we'll get very long posts in the tap group, my, like, it'll be the parents, and they'll say, my parents, they may be trying, but they're pretty darn racist, and we didn't realize how much. But I feel if I deprive my children of their grandparents, that will have a negative impact. And I always say, okay, you have to sort through and see what the, sort through the pros and cons. And maybe it means having a very, very limited interaction also. Like you see them at Christmas, right? And you hope that no horrible thing will happen around the dinner table. But I will say I have some empathy there. I think that, my parents are long deceased, but I think if I were able to have a conversation with them as an adult, my being an adult, they probably would say, yeah, we were not prepared for what our extended families would be like. And it can be complex, and you have to, so I struggled when I was a young adult with whether I wanted to have any connection with my parents' relatives. And the long and the short of it is I don't, because now all of my aunts and uncles are dead. They were the ones who were more racist. And my cousins are, man, I'm like totally different from them, totally. And I'm glad that I've lost touch over time. No one like slammed the door. It was more like I just quietly faded away, and I think they're glad too, to be honest.
Yeah, that's what's happening to me now. My cousins are slowly starting to back off, and but it's painful.
It's painful. Yeah, it's painful. I'm deeply empathetic, Ruth. I experienced it myself, but honestly, I do feel more free in the sense that I am so different from them. I can't even tell you. We have nothing to talk about. So what's sad is that when I was a child, my mother was one of 5 children, and we were close with all our cousins. So that was nice. It was good. It was good for me. Now, as adults, we have nothing in common, and I really have virtually no contact with them now at this point. So stuff happens. Thank you, Ruth. Were there any other questions, Tony? Anyone else?
There were not in the chat. If anyone has any additional questions, please feel free to ask those now, though.
I would just like to say how much I've enjoyed this talk. My children are adopted. They're not Black, they're not brown, they're not Asian, but they're a different ethnicity, and a lot relates because My ex-husband and I were Irish, German, and English, and his parents could not accept Polish children.
Hmm.
And they just wouldn't. And they wouldn't even come to my second baby's christening. So, I mean, it's just, there are all kinds of prejudiced people in the world, but I'm glad I listened to this because a lot of it relates. And I really tried to have a lot of Polish stuff in their lives, and whatever. We got to live in Czech Republic, so they got some Slavic, even though it wasn't Polish, some Czech upbringing. But I loved your talk, and I'd love to meet you, Mark. I think
Well, thank you.
I love your attitude and I have open adoption. We're friends with the birth mother, and it's helped not only my kids but me. So
Thank you.
I love everything you had to say.
Oh, thank you. I'm not sure who this is, but
Wendy Harris.
oh, Wendy.
Brookline, Massachusetts,
Okay.
near Boston.
Great.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Wendy. I really appreciate that. Yeah, it's funny. Even I know what you're talking about. Even within the white race, there's still terrible bias against certain groups, and man, it's tough. So I'm glad we were helpful to you. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Wendy. Are there perhaps a final question? Is there anyone with the last question to ask Mark before we close for the night?
Well, thank you so much, Tony. This has been great. You are such a leader in the adoption world, and I just really appreciate you. And I hope that you will continue to share your light. You have a great story. You shared a piece of that in the book, and I'm so glad. And I'll just say again, there are a zillion different stories of us adult transracial adoptees, and every one of us is an individual. But when we come together, it's amazing how much we do have in common and how much we can support each other by sharing with each other. And so I'm glad to be in this space with you.
Well, thank you so much, Mark, and likewise. And thanks to all of you as well for participating in this fantastic, phenomenal discussion. Please also, again, feel free to purchase Mark's book. It's in the chat box. It's also, like he said, on his website as well. And please feel free to follow up with any additional questions. This was recorded, so we will be sharing the recording on the C.A.S.E Instagram page and also on our website as well in the coming days and week or so as well. So please be on the lookout for that.
And what I'm going to do, Tony, is I'm typing in my email address. So if anyone wants to reach out to me individually and personally, I welcome it, and let's connect.
Thank you all again so much, and have a great evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, you guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you.